Order, order. We start with questions. Secretary of State for Scotland, Lillian Jones.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll answer questions 1 and 9 together. Mr. Speaker, the Scotland Office is supporting the White Ribbon Scotland campaign. It asks people to sign a pledge to never commit, condone or remain silent about violence against women. I have signed, as has my honourable friend, the member from Midlothian. I would encourage Scottish members from across the House to come to Dover House foyer and sign the pledge themselves. This government has a mission to halve violence against women and girls over the next decade, and I'm sure it's something the whole House would support. Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable lady for her question? Economic growth is our #1 mission in this government, and we announced a historic budget for Scotland that chose investment over decline and the end to austerity. On top of a record settlement, the UK Government is investing nearly £1.4 billion into local growth projects in Scotland, creating the National Wealth Fund to support a new industrial strategy and driving the transition to clean energy via GB Energy, which is of course headquartered in Aberdeen.
Lillian Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first Labour budget in 14 years delivered £4.9 billion for Scotland and Barnett consequentials, the biggest settlement since devolution put an end to the area of austerity. On top of this, the Labour budget also confirmed £20 million for Kilmarnock within my constituency, and I thank the Secretary of State for ensuring that funding was delivered, despite the £22 billion black hole left in the public finances by the Tories. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? The last Tory government made promises to Scotland they had no intentions of keeping.
Mr. Speaker, can I not only thank my honourable friend for that question, but the tenacity in which she has backed Kilmarnock in the budget to make sure she got more funding for our local area. And I think it's an absolute disgrace, Mr. Speaker, that the previous government made promises to communities like Kilmarnock about funding that they had never any intention of keeping. But this government went in and funded those projects, chose investment over decline, and will deliver growth and higher living standards. The irony, of course, Mr. Speaker, being that the SNP voted against the largest funding settlement in the history of devolution yesterday, but of course will spend it today.
Martin Rhodes.
Mr. Speaker, I recently visited Vector Photonics in my constituency, an optical and photonics centre of excellence. It's a successful spin-out from Glasgow University. What role does the Secretary of State believe there is for starter and spin-out tech companies in economic growth in Scotland?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish Vector Photonics well. Supporting start-ups and spin-out tech companies and world-leading Scottish universities that often incubate them is an important part of this government's steadfast commitment to economic growth. I was privileged to see firsthand the importance of these spin-outs during my recent visit to Malaysia and Singapore, where I discussed this with the Scottish universities that are present in those countries and representatives from the government and business. We know, Mr. Speaker, Scottish universities punch well above their weight internationally. It's something we should nurture and something we should be very proud of.
Mr. Speaker, with your indulgence, can I wish Peter McMahon well as he steps down as Scottish political editor of ITV Border. Peter's provided outstanding coverage of not just Scottish questions in this Parliament, but Scottish politics more generally to my constituents and those across the south of Scotland. I'm sure the Secretary of State will, as I do, welcome the fact that the life of Torness nuclear power station has been extended. That's good for energy security and good for the Scottish economy. But given that energy is a reserved matter, what more can he do to bring new nuclear development to Scotland?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I join the right honourable gentleman on his tribute to Peter McMahon as the political editor of ITV in the Borders region. We share something closely, the honourable gentleman and I, that we've both got good faces for radio, but nonetheless, when we perform with Peter McMahon on television, it's always a nice thing to do. This government is committed to clean power by 2030, and of course nuclear is part of that mix.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister, I'm sure, very clearly recognises the fact that with the national insurance contributions rise, that will impact clearly upon economic growth, whether it be in Scotland or anywhere else in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In particular, the food sector tells me that food will increase by between 15% and 20%. That will impact the ordinary man and woman in the street. So when it comes to economic growth, what's the Minister's idea in relation to national insurance contributions and the impact that will have?
Mr. Speaker, well, economic growth is the #1 mission of this government, as the honourable gentleman knows. When the Chancellor got to this dispatch box to deliver her budget, she started on minus £22 billion, that black hole that was left with us from the previous government. We chose investment over decline, we chose to end austerity, so tough decisions had to be made.
Shadow Minister Andrew Barr.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State has said before, and he said again today, that one of his top priorities for the Scotland office is growth. Well, to grow, Mr Speaker, you need confidence from business. So let's just see how that is going, because the verdict from Scottish businesses to his government's budget is in. From OE UK, this is a difficult day for the sector. From Scottish Hospitality, today's announcement are a blow to businesses across the country. From the Scotch Whisky Association, the increase in spirits duty is a hammer blow. From the NFUS, the decisions will cause huge difficulties to farming. So given these responses, if it isn't from retail or oil and gas or hospitality or food and drink or financial services, from which sector does he think this mythical growth is going to come from?
Mr Speaker, can I firstly congratulate and welcome the honourable gentleman to his place as the new Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland and Shadow Energy Minister. He shares something in common with the leader of the SNP in this House, who aspires also to have 2 jobs. Mr Speaker, unlike the honourable gentleman, I have actually run my own business, and when you run your own business, what you need is stability, what you need is credibility, what you need confidence. The previous government left this economy in tatters, they crashed the economy, they left business confidence at a record low. We're investing for the future, and businesses back that.
Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Look, I'd take the right honourable gentleman's responses more seriously if we didn't all see, and indeed have just heard, how damaging his government's actions are for the Scottish economy. National insurance increases, punitive tax rises on our most successful industries, putting at risk the future of family farms and the rural economy, and a Secretary of State who'd rather make performative gestures such as refusing to cross a picket line outside his own department instead of meeting Scotland's business leaders. So as people, local authorities and businesses await the Scottish Government's budget later today, does he agree that when it comes to economic incompetence, Scotland really does have, in his government and the proven ineptitude of the SNP, the very worst of all worlds?
Mr Speaker, I may be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think the honourable gentleman backed the former Prime Minister Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister, who crashed the economy, who left a £22 billion black hole. Well, he shakes his head and said that he didn't, but he walked down the lobbies with her when she was doing these things with the budget. So he did back the previous Prime Minister Liz Truss. So we'll take no lectures from that side of the House in terms of A, how to run the economy, B, how to back business, and of course he's left the highest tax burden on working people in 70 years, another inheritance that this government is going to have to try and resolve.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm sure, like the honourable member from West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine and myself, the Secretary of State for Scotland is watching with bated breath to see the latest Scottish budget after 17 years of incompetence. People are looking for change in Scotland. The Labour Party are promising it. So will he follow the initiative of his Scottish leader, Anas Sarwar, in saying that he will reinstate the winter fuel allowance and make representations to the Prime Minister to reconsider those other policies, such as the national insurance changes, which are creating instability and uncertainty for the Scottish economy?
Well, Mr Speaker, I have a lot of respect for the honourable lady, but again, it's another instance of where the opposition parties in this chamber want all the benefits of the budget, but they don't want to be able to pay for it. £47.7 billion is the largest settlement in devolution's history for Scotland, £4.9 billion extra. The Chancellor delivered £4.9 billion extra in Barnett consequences alone from this dispatch box during the budget, something that the SNP voted against but will spend today.
Dr Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Question number 2, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With your permission, I'll answer questions 2 and 10 together. This government is fully committed to delivering for veterans, and I pay tribute to them and their families for the sacrifices that they make during their service, as well as their valued contribution to our society after they leave. The Minister for Veterans and People is leading work across government and with the Scottish Government to ensure veterans and their families can access all of the support that they need.
Dr Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. There is significant variability between the provision of veteran services across the nations. What steps is the Secretary of State taking alongside his Cabinet colleagues to ensure there is parity of services across the nations and in particular in Scotland?
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. So the Minister for Veterans is leading this work. The Prime Minister has made a recent announcement about giving veterans social housing exemption. I can confirm that that will bring England in line with Scotland, where veterans are already exempt from local connection requirement to access social housing. So we are creating a level playing field across the nations to support veterans, as I mentioned in my first answer.
Robin Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since 1921, the British Royal Legion Scotland have been supporting veterans and their families through education, remembrance and direct support. And this weekend, in my own constituency of Keighley, the Town Council, alongside community groups, are unveiling a memorial to the fallen of the First World War, with a time capsule being placed under the cenotaph, which is to be opened in 100 years' time. So does the Minister agree that it is events like these that bring together the whole community are of vital importance for our veterans, not only in Keighley, but across Scotland and the wider United Kingdom?
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I join the honourable member in paying tribute to the volunteers often who run these kind of events. I'd also like to draw the House's attention to the work of the War Memorials Trust, one of those many organisations unsung doing incredible work across this country to maintain war memorials so that we all may remember. We have across this House many veterans and those who have served. I'd like to pay tribute to them all, and in particular to the 13 members on these benches who are veterans or reservists.
Dr. Zubia Hammond.
Mr Speaker, last week I had the honour of attending the steel-cutting ceremony of HMS Sheffield at BAE Govan in my constituency of Glasgow South West, adding to a long list in the tradition of high-quality building of defence industry vessels on the Clyde. What assurances can the Minister give me that defence procurement and skills will continue to be developed on the Clyde?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can give my honourable friend the firmest of assurances that we will continue to prioritise shipbuilding on the Clyde and indeed defence jobs across Scotland.
Elaine Stewart.
Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, may I answer questions 3 and 11 together? Our economic growth mission will raise living standards in Scotland. Our new deal for working people will disproportionately benefit Scots. New protections like guaranteed hours will help shift workers with up to £600 a year. We're also delivering an annual pay rise of £1,400 for hundreds of thousands of full-time workers in Scotland, and have committed to the triple lock, which means an extra £470 for pensioners next year. And last week we paid the first instalment to 7,000 former Scottish miners with their full pension. We will improve living standards by better public services and pay driven by economic growth.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that community benefit funds from wind farms contributions to improve living standards for communities? And would he join me in praising the work of the 9 Community Council Group in Aircarrick and Cumnock as a model for fair distribution funds to support local apprenticeships and improve living standards across Cumnock and Doon Valley areas?
Mr Speaker, I not only congratulate the 9 community councils in her area for their initiative, but the community councils up and down the country who do so much work on our behalf, which ensures that the Community Benefit Fund derived from local wind farms make a tangible difference to local people, and I congratulate my honourable friend for standing up consistently for our community. Our mission is to become a clean energy superpower by 2030, and communities will be at the heart of this. Communities must benefit from hosting national infrastructure for clean power. That is why my right honourable friend, the Energy Secretary, is developing guidance on community benefits, which will be published in due course.
McAllister.
Speaker, 100,000 Scots are on zero-hour contracts with no guarantee of secure hours. Labour's Employment Rights Bill will address this. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that 100,000 Scots in insecure work is a damning indictment of the state the Tories left our economy in, and shows that we need a new direction in Holyrood?
Mr Speaker, you'll not be surprised to hear that I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Absolutely shocked. The government inherited not just a fiscal crisis from the previous government, but an industrial one as well. We need more high-quality jobs in Scotland, so between our industrial strategy, our plan to get Scotland working, and our employment rights legislation, we will help to deliver that. Don't forget the SNP government said that zero-hours contracts were a positive destination for work. Our plans to make work pay will have a bigger positive benefit in Scotland than the rest of the UK. That's the difference having Scottish Labour MPs on this side of the House.
Stephen Gattins.
Mr Speaker, and can I join the Secretary of State for Scotland in welcoming the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland to his place as well, and congratulate him on his appointment. It does make it difficult sometimes to tell the two of them apart, that being said, especially on days like today, when today the Scottish Government will continue to protect the most vulnerable in society from the excesses of Westminster cuts, but instead of Tory cuts, it will be Labour cuts when it comes to the winter fuel payments. So, can the Secretary of State tell me, does he agree with the cut to the winter fuel allowance?
Mr Speaker, I'm sorry for such a short response to the honourable gentleman, but there's 4.9 billion reasons why that question was rubbish.
I have to say, I'm not surprised. There's huge confusion in the Labour Party about the winter fuel allowance. The Scottish Government is doing something about it. The UK Government is not. Now, the Secretary of State did not even know the number of pensioners who would be affected by the winter fuel cut. Labour
are now distancing themselves from Labour. So can he tell me, is the message that his party is sending out to vote Labour to stop Labour, or should voters just vote for the party who are actually doing something about it?
Mr. Speaker, I think what the honourable gentleman is tending to forget is the winter fuel payment in Scotland is devolved. It was the SNP Scottish Government that decided to means test it as well, and if it wasn't for the £4.9 billion extra delivered by our Labour Chancellor at this dispatch box to end austerity that they will spend today, they wouldn't be able to make any decisions whatsoever.
Question 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Honourable Lady for her work with the Chancellor to help deliver a record budget settlement for Scotland. It is the largest Scottish Government budget settlement in the history of devolution. It is now up to the Scottish Government to ensure that our towns feel the benefit of it. There can be absolutely no more excuses from the SNP. The budget also confirmed nearly £1.4 billion of funding for local growth projects, and we are delivering growth deals in all parts of Scotland, many of which are improving town centres and other community assets.
Mr. Speaker, Hamilton is a brilliant place to live and work, but the boarded-up shops on Quarry Street tell a story of their own. Can the Minister tell me what can this government do to support businesses across Hamilton and Clyde Valley and Scotland who have suffered so badly under the chaos and neglect of two governments, Conservative and SNP?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member is absolutely correct, and I commend her for standing up for her town. In England, this Labour government has already delivered lower business rates for leisure, hospitality and retail, which can help the high street. And I'm sure every Scottish MP wants to see that policy replicated in Scotland. As we are discussing brilliant towns, it's timely to mention brilliant retail workers too, particularly at this time of year. That's why I'm supporting the Scottish Retail Consortium and USDA's Christmas campaign to encourage everyone to respect our shop workers at this particularly busy time of year.
Speaker, Ullapool in my constituency for far too long did not have a post office, had great inconvenience to local people. But recently, Tesco stepped into the breach and we have a highly successful post office in Tesco's in the middle of Ullapool. Can I recommend this procedure, this approach, in terms of regenerating town centres to the front bench? Opposite.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are delighted to receive representations of all sorts about how to improve our town centres, but we do know that they have suffered neglect for far too long, and as I say, I'm hoping that all Scottish MPs will have been lobbying for the kind of support to our leisure, hospitality and retail sector that this Labour government has already given south of the border.
John Lamell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I firstly pay tribute to the honourable gentleman, my predecessor? I know he will continue to represent his constituents assiduously from the backbenches. Both the Secretary of State and I will be working closely with the Department for Transport and the Scottish Government to make sure that cross-border connectivity remains a top priority for this Government.
Mr. Speaker, extending the Borders Railway to Hoyt, Newcastleton and on to Carlisle will boost jobs, help the local economy and improve social mobility. The funding for the feasibility study was agreed by the last Conservative Government with the SNP administration in Edinburgh. But the new Labour Government seems to have pushed this into the railway siding. So will the Minister ensure that the funding for the feasibility study is released as soon as possible?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government is fully committed to the Borderlands Growth Deal, which will deliver economic growth for the south of Scotland and beyond, a key mission of this Government. The Scotland Office continues to work with the Department for Transport, the Scottish Government and Borderlands partners on the next stage of the business case development for the Tweedbank-Carlisle corridor and feasibility options to extend Borders Railway. It is unfortunately ultimately in the hands of Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government to follow through on the delivery of this important project.
Secretary of State Andrew Bowen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the words of the Minister regarding her predecessor and indeed my predecessor as Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland and the work that he has done. One of the decisions taken by the previous government, of which I am most proud, was the halving of air passenger duty, which led to cheaper flights and increased routes across the United Kingdom. But with airlines already cutting back on routes as a result of their government's decision to hike APD, people who don't live within a few-hour train journey to London, such as Aberdeen, face higher fares and fewer options for travel. So how can they credibly claim to support better transport connectivity across the United Kingdom when those living outside the Central Belt, and I know Labour do need to be reminded that does exist, are being punished?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable gentleman will know that we face a climate emergency and indeed an economic emergency of his government's own making. We were faced with a £22 billion black hole, with Treasury reserves spent 3 times over in the first few months of the government. We've taken tough choices to try and deal with the economic inheritance we've received.
Frank McNally.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 6 and 12 together. We have reset the relationship with the Scottish Government and have met with the Deputy First Minister multiple times to discuss the autumn budget and other issues. From the moment my honourable friend the Chancellor stood up at this dispatch box to the moment she sat down, Scotland was better off by the tune of £4.9 billion in Barnett consequentials alone. Again, something the SNP voted against but will spend today. I encourage the Scottish Government to use that money to strengthen frontline services, bring down NHS waiting times and lift attainment in our schools. There are no more excuses. We ended austerity. It's time they followed.
Frank McNally.
Mr Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. A thriving retail, hospitality and leisure sector is critical to brand Scotland. Following the welcome decision in the budget to ensure 40% rates relief for RHL businesses in England, what guarantees, if any, has my right honourable friend had from the Scottish Government that the extra Barnett consequentials linked to non-domestic rates will be passed on at today's Scottish budget? And does he agree with me that any failure to do so would be deeply damaging to the sector?
Thank you to my honourable friend for that question. He is absolutely correct. The UK budget shows investment over decline, including investment directly in my honourable friend's constituency as part of the £200 million Towns Fund, as well as the biggest budget settlement in the history of devolution. He's also right that our hospitality businesses in particular need this rates relief more than ever. The Scottish Government should be using that budget to deliver growth and investment to help our high streets, and passing on these reliefs should be the bare minimum from the Scottish Government.
Irene Campbell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have delivered the biggest budget settlement to the Scottish Government in the history of devolution, with more than £4.9 billion, as you've heard today, of extra funding that can go to public services. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that there are no more excuses for the SNP and that Scots expect and deserve delivery and improvement to our public services?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Of course, I couldn't agree more. It's not just the £9 billion in Barnett consequentials, but all the other investment the UK Government made outside those Barnett consequentials. The Labour Government has delivered billions of pounds more for schools and hospitals in Scotland. Mr Speaker, it's more money than ever before, but the SNP MPs voted against it. They voted to deny Holyrood its biggest ever budget settlement by voting against the Finance Bill last week, but of course they will happily spend it in their budget today. They also voted against GB Energy in the SNP leader's own constituency. Given what we've read about the SNP's selection processes, I guess the SNP MPs seem keener to send themselves to Holyrood than billions of pounds of extra funding.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, I'm sure the pensioners in the Secretary of State's constituency are as relieved as those in Argyll, Bute and South Lochaber that the Scottish Government's budget will introduce a pension age winter heating payment for all Scottish pensioners. The SNP Government is doing the right thing by Scottish pensioners. So will he join me in urging the Labour Government here at Westminster to also do the right thing by the pensioners of England and Wales and give back to them their winter fuel allowance as well?
Mr Speaker, what the honourable gentleman has just proved is the winter fuel payment in Scotland is actually devolved.
The consequences of the budget was to remove £5 million of regeneration funding for Perth city centre. We got practically nothing from their levelling up fund, save this paltry £5 million that he is even taking away. Just what is it that UK Government has against the city of Perth?
Mr Speaker, no projects have been cancelled. The Perth deal is being under consideration by MHCLG and the Treasury. It hasn't been cancelled, it has been merely paused. But what I would say is that the honourable gentleman should speak to his colleagues in the Scottish Government, who have got £4.9 billion extra in Barnett consequentials to spend today, and perhaps he could even have a chat with some of his colleagues sitting next to him who seem happier in Holyrood than they are here.
Seamus Logan.
Question number 7, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know there is consensus right across this House on the enormous value of the hospice sector and the extraordinary work that they do, work which has been sadly undervalued for far too long. Support for the additional employer national insurance contributions will be allocated to departments, with the Barnett formula applying in the usual way for devolved governments. The rise does not begin until April, and will set out further details on the allocation of funding in due course.
Thanks. Good night. Seamus Logan.
Oh, Seamus.
Mr. Speaker, there are 45 hospices in Scotland. I can't be certain of that figure because so many of them are in dire financial circumstances. I think of Roxburgh House in Aberdeen, which provides services to my constituents and to other MPs in this Chamber's constituents. Another organisation that provides vital hospice care is the Marie Curie charity, which provides services in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and they also provide hospice at home care. They are facing a bill close to £3 million as a result of decisions by this government. So what does the Minister have to say in relation to help that can be provided to Marie Curie and other organisations?
Good question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable gentleman will know, the pressures on hospice funding long predate the budget and relate to declining real terms funding from the Scottish Government. I note that nearly 5,000 members of the public have written to the Scottish Government recently to support calls from the Scottish Hospice Leadership Group for fair funding. Those calls might be answered this afternoon, where the SNP Government has to spend an extra £5 billion, secured by Scottish Labour MPs, voted against by SNP MPs and spent this afternoon by SNP ministers. Make it make sense.
Right.